What we've witnessed President Trump accomplish over the last few days has been nothing short of remarkable. We are now 3.5 years into the war between Russia and Ukraine, a brutal conflict that has claimed hundreds of thousands of Russian and Ukrainian lives and cost trillions of dollars. The weakness and incompetence of Joe Biden foolishly allowed the killing to start in the first place. Until President Trump returned to office in January, the bloody and broken Biden status quo was to endlessly force American taxpayers to fund Ukraine no matter the cost, no matter how long it takes, and no matter how many lives were lost. There is no denying that Biden's America Last foreign policy moved the world further away from peace. President Trump rejected that failed approach and instead, over the last 7 months, has relentlessly pursued peace throughout his second term. And thanks to President Trump's efforts, we finally have movement after years of deadly gridlock. On Friday, as you all know, many of you were there, President Trump hosted Russian President Vladimir Putin in Anchorage, Alaska, for a bilateral meeting. This was the first time President Putin has been to the United States since 2015, and the first time he has met with an American president in years. President Putin publicly confirmed what President Trump has said all along. The war between Russia and Ukraine never would have started in the first place if President Trump were in office. This was always obvious to any person with a shred of common sense. Just look at what took place during the last 4 administrations. Under George W. Bush, Russia invaded Georgia. Under Barack Obama, Russia took Crimea. Under Joe Biden, Russia invaded Ukraine. But under President Trump, Russia did not invade nor take anything. President Trump is the only president this century, Republican or Democrat, who has held Russia in check and ensured peace in Europe. That's because Russia has always greatly respected President Trump and his peace through strength foreign policy approach. But overall, the bilateral talks in Alaska were very productive, and multiple key points were agreed to between the two leaders that truly opened up the door for Phase 2 discussions, which took place yesterday here at the White House, within 48 hours of that meeting in Anchorage, I may add. As you all know, there were many European leaders here, as well as Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. They all traveled here to meet with President Trump to maintain the momentum and work toward a lasting peace. Across the board, every leader credited President Trump for his decisive leadership that has reignited the dialogue in hopes of finally bringing this war to a peaceful conclusion. 2 quotes in particular capture the progress that was made and the optimism moving forward. Finnish President Alexander Stubb said, "I think in the past 2 weeks, we've probably had more progress in ending this war than we have had in the past 3.5 years. Again, that is the president of Finland, a country that shares a border with Russia. That's what we call the President Trump effect. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte also summed it up well. Without President Trump, this deadlock with Putin would not have been broken. He is the only one who could do this." Following the encouraging conversations yesterday, President Trump spoke with President Putin by phone, and he agreed to begin the next phase of the peace process, a meeting between President Putin and President Zelenskyy, which would be followed, if necessary, by a trilateral meeting between President Putin, President Zelenskyy, and President Trump. As the president said, Vice President Vance, Secretary Rubio, and Special Envoy Witkoff will continue to coordinate with Russia and Ukraine to make this happen as soon as possible. It's very important to remember that before President Trump's landslide victory last November, there was no end in sight to this bloodshed. Now, there may finally be light at the end of the tunnel and an opportunity for lasting peace. That's because President Trump is the peace president, and American leadership is back on the world stage. It should not be lost on anyone in this room that world leaders are coming right here to Washington, D.C. for help. While previous presidents have traveled halfway around the world to apologize for America, President Trump stands up for America, and he has firmly restored America's status as the undisputed leader of the free world. However, one thing that has absolutely not changed is the media's negative and downright false coverage of President Trump and his foreign policy accomplishments. From the beginning of this entire process, much of the left-wing media has been actively rooting against the President of the United States in the pursuit of peace. Initially, the media ridiculously claimed that President Trump was somehow beholden to Russia for even agreeing to have a face-to-face discussion with President Putin inside of the United States. The media said said President Trump was making a grave mistake by, quote, legitimizing Putin. They were aghast that President Trump would treat another world leader like a world leader. The media relentlessly attacked President Trump and claimed he suffered a, quote, major defeat for not immediately emerging with a final agreement, even though he said heading into that meeting, this was a meeting to listen and to understand how to move the ball forward. All weekend following those historic U.S.-Russia bilateral talks, we listened to clueless pundits on television trying but failing to claim that the president had failed. The so-called experts in the foreign policy establishment, whose record is nothing but endless wars, trillions of wasted taxpayer dollars, and dead Americans, have the nerve to try and lecture President Trump, who has solved 7 global conflicts in 7 months, about peace. This is the same president, by the way, who brokered the Abraham Accords in his first term, on top of more than half a dozen other peace deals this year alone, as I just said. We also saw yesterday the president of Ukraine and all of the other major leaders of Europe fly across the Atlantic Ocean to meet President Trump at the White House because of the progress that was made, and that, if you ask the media, failed meeting, but it was not. It was highly productive and it was successful. This is why Americans' trust in the mass media is at a lowest point in more than 5 decades. Diplomacy is a delicate process, and instead of reporting the facts about what is happening here at this White House and what is happening between this president and other leaders around the world, many outlets in this room continue to try to actively undermine the president and sabotage the efforts towards peace. That is why I felt the need to set the record straight. In other news, on the home front, President Trump's efforts to make D.C. safe again are working. There have been a total of 465 arrests since the start of this operation on Thursday, August 7th. Last night, there were a total of 52 arrests, including the arrest of an illegal alien MS-13 gang member with convictions for DWI and drug possession. Thanks to President Trump's leadership and the outstanding work of both federal and local law enforcement, dangerous gang members like the one picked up last night will not be allowed on the streets of our nation's capital. Other arrests last night included assault with a deadly weapon for stabbing, parole violation for robbery, murder, outstanding warrant for attempted murder, assault on federal law enforcement officer, and felony assault. 4 more homeless encampments were also removed during yesterday's reporting period. To date, a total of 48 homeless encampments have been cleared in Washington, D.C. by multi-agency teams. MPD patrol units are actively working with city officials to locate and clear additional encampments and remove homeless residents off of Washington's streets. And despite fake narratives from the media, again, a significant number of the arrests have been in high-crime areas of D.C. In fact, nearly half of all of the non-illegal alien-related arrests have occurred in wards 7 and 8. The 2 wards that have the highest number of violent crime, as well as homicides and assaults with dangerous weapons last year. So while Democrats continue to coddle violent criminals, President Trump and this administration are focused on putting them behind bars and unapologetically standing up for the safety of law-abiding American citizens. And the White House will continue to provide all of you with the results of this operation in the days ahead. So with that, I will take your questions today. Here in our new media seat today, we have Jack Posobiec, who joined us in Anchorage, Alaska last week. Jack, thanks for being here. Why don't you kick us off?
Caroline, thanks so much. So a couple of questions regarding the status of these peace talks. Obviously, we saw the President and President Putin there in Anchorage. We saw the world leaders here yesterday with this summit. We've heard phrases like coalition of the willing. We've also heard Article 5-like guarantees. When it comes to the security guarantees, what is the current status of that? I know the President earlier today mentioned boots on the ground would be UK, France, Germany possibly, but unequivocally said no U.S. troops on the ground, but U.S. coordination. Can you elaborate on that, and what would the red lines be?
Sure. Well, you got to the heart of what I was going to say to all of you today on security guarantees, which is the President has definitively stated U.S. boots will not be on the ground in Ukraine, but we can certainly help in the coordination and perhaps provide other means of security guarantees to our European allies. The President understands security guarantees are crucially important to ensure a lasting peace, and he has directed his national security team to coordinate with our friends in Europe, and also to continue to cooperate and discuss these matters with Ukraine and Russia as well.
Caroline, now, have the Russians responded at all? I know we spoke with President Putin last night. What has been their response? Because we've heard some reports from the Kremlin and others saying they're unequivocally against NATO troops on the ground.
Well, look, the president continues to have these conversations with both leaders. Those conversations took place in Anchorage, Alaska, again yesterday with the Europeans and President Zelenskyy, and he has directed his team to come up with a framework for these security guarantees that can be acceptable to help ensure a lasting peace and end this war.
And then just last question real quick on this. Regarding some of the funding, we're hearing questions about another round of weapons sales or possibly a round of U.S. purchases of Ukrainian drones. Will that money be funded by the U.S. taxpayers? Or are we finally going to see an end to the U.S. taxpayer-funded, seemingly endless mandate for these foreign wars?
Well, the president is very sensitive to the needs of the American taxpayer, and immediately upon entering office back in January, he made it very clear that we're not going to continue writing blank checks to fund a war very far away, which is why he came up with the very creative solution to have NATO purchase American weaponry, because it is the best in the world, and then to backfill the needs of the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people and their military. So that's the solution the president has came up with. We'll continue to see that forward. As for any additional sales, I'll have to defer you to the Department of Defense.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jack. Kelly.
What has President Trump learned that tells him that Vladimir Putin would be willing to make a deal for him, for President Trump?
Well, the president has learned a lot, which is part of the reason he opened up this dialogue. The previous administration, who oversaw the beginning of this war, refused to talk. And President Trump has always said, in order to learn, in order to move the ball forward with diplomacy and towards peace, you have to have open dialogue. And so that's why the president has had several conversations by phone and, of course, an in-person meeting last Friday with President Putin. He also has talked to President Zelenskyy dozens of times, had him here at the White House yesterday, and he's understanding what both sides want, what both sides are going to have to give up. And he has always said, in order to get a good deal, both sides are going to have to walk away a little bit unhappy. So he continues to learn a lot throughout these conversations, which is why we've seen progress from both sides. And I would also just add, when it comes to learning and moving the ball forward, look at how both Russia and Ukraine have actually talked directly for the first time in many years, thanks to the efforts of this president and this administration.
Specifically for President Trump, though, what do you think Putin's motivation is to try to do something for President Trump, as opposed to just resolving the conflict?
I think, as I just spoke to in my opening remarks, Kelly, Russia and all countries around this world actually respect the United States again. And the president is using the might of American strength to demand that respect from our allies, our friends, our adversaries all around the world. And we've seen that not just lead to progress with Russia and Ukraine, but also we've seen it in the closing of 7 global conflicts around the world as well. We've seen it with the release of hostages in Gaza. You've seen it with the end of the conflict between India and Pakistan, which could have resulted in a nuclear war if we had not had a president who believed in the strength and the leverage that comes with the job of being the president of the United States of America. Rachel.
Thanks, Caroline. Heading into Alaska, a lot of the focus in the talk was on this trilateral meeting between these 3 leaders. Can you explain how this went from a trilateral meeting involving President Trump to now the focus being on this bilateral meeting without the president first?
Well, look, the president has spoken to both leaders about this, and both leaders have expressed a willingness to sit down with each other. And so our national security team will help both countries do that. Ultimately, the president has always said that there are areas of disagreement in this war that will have to be discussed and decided upon by these 2 countries. And so he wants these 2 countries to engage in direct diplomacy. He's said that from the very beginning, which is why he's agreeable to the idea of having President Zelenskyy and President Putin get together. And I understand accommodations for that meeting are underway. As soon as we hear more details, we'll be sure to let all of you know.
And just a quick follow-up. We know as of right now there is no ceasefire in place. We've seen Russia continue its attacks on Ukraine. What indications is the president getting from Putin that he wants to have this meeting with Zelenskyy soon?
Because he spoke to him directly yesterday.
And he expressed that
Haley,
sooner rather than later.
He spoke to that directly yesterday, and the president put that in his statement that he gave to all of you, the news media, knowing you'd be asking following that conversation in the effort of transparency. Haley.
Hey, thanks, Caroline. You made clear note U.S. boots on the ground. Is the president considering U.S. boots in the air as a form of a security guarantee?
Look, that was something the president mentioned on his interview this morning. It is an option and a possibility. I won't certainly rule out anything as far as military options that the president has at his disposal, I'll let him do that. I can tell you he's definitively ruled out boots on the ground. Sure.
Thanks, Tara. Just about the possible venue for the talks, can you confirm that Putin suggested Moscow as a venue for the bilateral talks? And if so, doesn't that indicate that Putin is perhaps not serious about this, that he's suggesting a venue that there's no way that Zelenskyy is going to go to?
Look, I'm not going to litigate the private conversations between the president and President Putin, aside from what the president himself has already spoken on. But I can tell you there are many options that are being discussed by our national security team right now with both parties.
Can you give us an indication of where?
I just told you we'll provide you details as soon as we can. Thank you for trying, though. Libby.
Thank you, Caroline. I wanted to ask about the National Guard troops. How is the White House coordinating with how they're being placed in D.C., what areas? And then also, how long should people here in the district anticipate the National Guard to be on the ground patrolling the streets?
I don't have a timeline for you, Libby, but we will keep you posted on that. I think the president, as you know, and this administration, he came to this briefing room with members of his cabinet to lay out the Metropolitan Police Department to make our district safer. We've seen violent crime has taken the lives of far too many residents here in our nation's capital, and the president wants to make it safe again. And as for the coordination efforts, this interagency team is meeting and talking daily. In fact, there's a meeting taking place right now in the West Wing with members of the interagency task force to continue to discuss not just the National Guard deployment, but also how we can continue to remove public safety threats off of the streets of Washington, which, as the numbers I just showed you prove, they are doing every single night. I will just reiterate, 465 total arrests and counting since the start of this operation. I believe 11 or 12 days ago. I'll have to check the calendar, but those are pretty remarkable results. If not for this task force and their high level of coordination and the leadership of this president, there would have been 465 more violent criminals on the streets of this capital that you all live in every day. So I think we should all be very grateful for that. Stephen.
Thank you, Caroline. 3 questions about the D.C. crackdown.
Sure.
First, I was wondering if you could clarify something President Trump said. He mentioned getting rid of the slums where criminals live. Was he talking about tents or permanent residential buildings? And then the mayor has expressed an interest in clarifying how much of a focus illegal immigration enforcement is as part of this crackdown. Can you say anything about that?
Sure.
And third, any preview on the beautification?
3 questions. I'll try to answer all 3 of them pointedly for you. First, when it comes to what you said and the president said, the slums of Washington, D.C., he's referring to the most dangerous communities, neighborhoods, and streets in this city where, unfortunately, violence has ravaged these communities and taken the lives of, again, far too many law-abiding D.C. residents. We know on July 5th of this year, just more than a month ago, a 3-year-old beautiful young girl was shot and killed in her car with her family in one of these communities, which is why there has been a surge, despite what many of you have been falsely reporting. And I believe it was the Washington Post who put out a map claiming it to be fact-based when it was just based on, I don't know, accounts that they've heard on the street, not actual statistics and data. So we went and reconfigured the numbers, and as I said, nearly half of all the non-illegal alien-related arrests have occurred in wards 7 and 8 in the District of Columbia, where we know, excuse me, there's the highest rate of crime. So we'll continue to do that. And what was your second question, Stephen?
Legal immigration, how much of a focus that is?
Yeah, look, I mean, the focus is to make D.C. safe and beautiful and to remove public safety threats and violent criminals from our streets. If federal law enforcement, with the help of the Metropolitan Police Department, come across illegal aliens, of course, we are going to abide by this administration's policy of law and order, and we are going to remove illegal criminals from our nation's capital. They will be detained and deported, just like they are in every other community across the country. Kristen.
First question is, whose idea was it to change the next steps from a trilateral to a bilateral meeting?
It was an idea that evolved in the course of the president's conversations with both President Putin, President Zelenskyy, and the European leaders yesterday. And as you saw, Kristen, with all of those European leaders leaving the White House, including the NATO Secretary General, they all agreed that this is a great first step. And it's a good thing that these 2 leaders are going to be sitting down together, and the president expects that to happen.
And how long is Trump willing to wait and operate in good faith for Putin to actually arrange change a meeting before he intervenes?
Look, the president has put tremendous public pressure to bring this war to a close. He's taken actions, as you've seen, sanctions on India and other actions as well. He's made himself very clear that he wants to see this war end, and he has scoffed at the ideas of others that have been raised that we should wait another month before any meeting takes place. The president wants to move, and he wants to bring this war to an end as quickly as possible.
Just a clarification on
Sean.
something you said earlier about Putin agreeing to the meeting. The Kremlin seemed to indicate that Putin did not firmly agree to a bilateral. Did he agree to have a sit-down with just Zelenskyy on the phone?
I can assure you that the United States government and the Trump administration is working with both Russia and Ukraine to make that bilateral happen as we speak. Sean.
Hey, if the point is to get everybody on the same page, why wouldn't Trump just take the call from Putin while the other leaders were in the room? He said it would be disrespectful to do that. But why is it disrespectful?
With all due respect, only a reporter from the New York Times would ask a question like that, Sean. The president met with all of these European leaders at the White House 48 hours after sitting down with President Putin on American soil. In fact, there was so much progress in the readout that was given to these European leaders immediately following his meeting with President Putin that every single one of them got on a plane 48 hours later and flew to the United States of America. And if I could just read for all of you some of the statements from those European leaders yesterday, you had President Zelenskyy himself saying it was a very good conversation. It was really good. We spoke about very sensitive points. The Secretary General, Mark Rutte, it was the president, only because of the president, that this deadlock was broken, but with President Putin by starting a dialogue. So these leaders, who this war is in their backyard, are very grateful that the president took that call and that he was there to provide them with a readout of Russia's thinking on this, something that was not done by the previous administration at all. Catherine.
Thank you. Is the White House looking at Budapest as a possible location?
I'm not going to confirm or deny locations. We'll provide you with details as soon as we can.
Just following up on Kristen's question, I understand that the White House is working and allies are working to make this meeting happen, but did Putin promise to do a meeting with Zelenskyy, a direct meeting, in the coming weeks?
He has, and I just answered that question for you. Franco.
Thanks. I just want to clarify. So you are saying that President Trump is considering U.S. pilots and U.S. aircraft potentially supporting European or Ukrainian forces?
The president spoke to that himself this morning when he called into Fox and Friends, and I would defer you to his answer. You can read it directly yourself.
In addition, can I ask, no boots on the ground, Steve Witkoff's talking about Article 5-like security guarantees. Can you talk about what other Article 5-like security guarantees that are being considered if it's not boots on the ground?
These are very sensitive diplomatic discussions that are currently taking place literally as we speak. So I will leave it to the national security team, and I'll leave it to the president to have those private discussions with these leaders as we try to bring this war to an end.
And can I ask one
Mary
more?
Margaret, go ahead.
Thanks, Caroline. Two questions, if that's okay. So on these meetings, I know you said that the trilateral will take place if necessary. Do you think that we might not need the trilateral and that Zelenskyy and Putin might come to this conclusion on their own? And then as a follow-up, I know the president said on Fox News this morning that he's partially seeking peace in order to get to heaven. Was he joking, or is there spiritual motivation behind his peace deals here?
I think the president was serious. I think the president wants to get to heaven, as I hope we all do in this room as well. Annie.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm just shifting gears to the Department of Justice for a minute. Can you walk us through why another deputy FBI director was named? Does Trump have any displeasure with how the FBI has been being run to date? And then I have a question about the antitrust division.
No, Andrew Bailey is extremely qualified. As you know, he's been serving with honor as the Attorney General of Missouri, and he's been brought on as another set of very credible and experienced hands to work alongside the current Deputy Director, Dan Bongino, under the leadership of the Director, Kash Patel, and the Attorney General, Pam Bondi. And the FBI has been doing a tremendous job. We've seen their agents out on the streets as part of this interagency task force here in Washington. But the crime that they've been stopping here in Washington, they've been doing this for 7 months all across the country. In fact, there's been 19,000 arrests by the FBI nationwide. That's more than double last year in the same time period. Of those, 1,600 arrests were for violent crimes against children. 4,000 child victims have been rescued by this FBI under this current leadership. 1,000 arrests from investigations of foreign terrorist organizations. There's been 1,500 kilos of fentanyl seized. 6,300 kilos of meth have been seized, and 3 of the top 10 most wanted have been arrested so far. Not a single one of the individuals on the top 10 most wanted list were arrested under the previous administration. We've arrested 3 in 7 months. So when you're actually working and enforcing law and order, you need all hands on deck. And so we look forward to welcoming Andrew Bailey to this new post. Jackie.
I have a quick question about Roger Alfred, who's a former DOJ official. He gave a speech in Aspen yesterday where he said that senior DOJ aides are cutting deals with favored lobbyists. I'm wondering if the president has any concerns at all with the way the antitrust division is working.
I have no idea who that individual is. I don't know why he made those comments. I don't know what basis he's making those comments on. My instinct tells me it's not true, but we will definitely look into them and I'll get you a response.
Thank you, Caroline.
Jackie.
Thanks, Caroline. Since the president often says that this war would not have started if he were in office, and Putin confirmed that.
It's true. Do you accept that as true? The European leaders do.
Well,
and President Putin himself said that, by the way.
He did say that. The question I have, though, is what is the president going to do to ensure that these security guarantees last beyond him into the time when he is no longer president? And does that have to involve Congress at all?
Well, he understands the need for that, which he spoke to yesterday. And what's he going to do? It's why he's engaging in so many talks and so many conversations with both sides of this war with our European allies. It's why on the way home from Anchorage, Alaska, very late at night, when I know many of you on the press plane were sleeping and many staff were sleeping, the president himself was still awake at 2 o'clock in the morning talking to European leaders and NATO about how we can ensure a lasting peace and bring this conflict to an end. He has expended an incredible amount of time, energy, and effort into bringing this war to an end, and he remains determined to do that.
Also, can I ask you about the
Thank you, Caroline.
DC crime?
Sure, Jake, and then to your right.
Right. Thank you, Caroline. Which of the half-dozen peace deals that the president's pulled off would you say he's the most proud of? And then I have another question.
That's a good question, Jake. I'll leave that to the president to answer. I think he's proud of all of the peace deals that he's been able to achieve. You saw the president of Armenia and the head of Azerbaijan both at the White House just a couple of weeks ago. The president, I know, very much enjoyed spending time with them and helping to bring that conflict to an end. He very much enjoyed his time with leaders of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo in the Oval Office, talking to them about bringing that decades-long war to an end. India and Pakistan. He used trade in a very powerful way as leverage to bring that conflict to an end. So I know he's very proud of all of these achievements, and I know he's very honored to serve as the President of the United States and to restore peace around this world. Go ahead.
So you mentioned Armenia and Azerbaijan. That's a conflict that, I spent time in the Southern Caucasus covering that. And, a conflict of over 30 years, and he resolved it in just a couple of months. Mm-hmm. Are there other conflicts that the president's working on right now that are off the radar screen that we should be tracking?
In fact, there are many. The State Department is always working around the clock under the leadership of Secretary Rubio and keeping the president apprised of conflicts that are bubbling up all over the world. But of course, as you all know, as we've talked a lot about in this briefing, he's spending a lot of time right now on ending this war in Russia-Ukraine, and of course the conflict in Israel and Gaza, which he wants to see come to a close as well. Sure, go ahead.
So the president says that he's starting a movement to eliminate mail-in voting, but states administer elections, not federal authorities. So can you provide any more details about how the White House plans to eliminate that?
Mm-hmm. The White House continues to work on this, and when Congress comes back to Washington, I'm sure there will be many discussions with our friends on Capitol Hill and also our friends in state legislatures across the country to ensure that we're protecting the integrity of the vote for the American people. And I think Republicans generally and the president generally wants to make it easier for Americans to vote and harder for people to cheat in our elections. And it's quite mind-boggling that the Democrat Party could stand in opposition to common sense. He wants to ensure election integrity. There were great efforts that were made in 2024. I won't get ahead of myself for Hatch Act reasons to get ahead for the next election, but I can assure you this is a priority for the president. Go ahead.
If I could just follow up on your comments about Gaza.
Sure.
There was a ceasefire proposal put forward by both Qatar and Egypt. Mm-hmm. Hamas accepted it on Monday. Israel has yet to officially weigh in. I'm wondering if the U.S. was at all involved in it, if it's supportive of it, and whether or not the president believes Israel should accept it.
I don't think it's a coincidence that Hamas accepted this proposal after the President of the United States posted a very strong statement about this conflict on Truth Social yesterday. I would refer you back to that statement. As for this proposal that Hamas has now accepted, the United States continues to discuss it, and I'll let the President weigh in on it definitively. You're welcome. Sure.
Caroline, can you describe the President's perspective on taking a stake in Intel in exchange for federal grants? And is this are we expecting to see the White House make similar arrangements with other semiconductor companies and manufacturing companies?
Well, the President, he's been very clear about the need to reshore manufacturing that's critical to our national and economic security. That is especially in regards to chips and semiconductors, which is why the President has initiated the Commerce Department to conduct a study on semiconductors, a Section 232 investigation, so we can ultimately implement tariffs. And it's why our export license requirements remain in place as well. As for this 10% government stake deal, the Department of Commerce continues to work on it. I know Secretary Lutnick is working on it and ironing out the details, but the President wants to put America's needs first, both from a national security and economic perspective. And it's a creative idea that has never been done before to ensure that we're both reshoring these critical supply chains while also gaining something of it for the American taxpayer. You're welcome. Emily.
Thanks, Caroline. I wanted to ask about the 3 U.S. warships that are being sent to Venezuela, and there's 4,000 Marines on board. Are you looking at possibility of boots on the ground there?
What I will say with respect to Venezuela, President Trump has been very clear and consistent. He's prepared to use every element of American power to stop drugs from flooding into our country and to bring those responsible to justice. The Maduro regime is not the legitimate government of Venezuela. It is a narco-terror cartel. In Maduro, it is the view of this administration, is not a legitimate president. He is a fugitive head of this cartel who has been indicted in the United States for trafficking drugs into the country. And with that, I will leave you all, and we will see you later, if not tomorrow. And I look forward to taking more of your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. Thank you.
President Trump yesterday hosting an entourage of European leaders at the White House, with the end game being aimed at ending the Russia-Ukraine war for good. Trump since has touted the meeting, calling it a pathway to peace, and saying he's trying to bring a final close to the deadliest conflict in Europe that's now been going strong for 3.5 years. Those visiting heads of state commending the effort to end the bloodshed.
The fact that you have said, I'm willing to participate in the security guarantees is a big step.
I think in the past 2 weeks, we've probably had more progress in ending this war than we have in the past 3.5 years.
I think it is an important day, a new phase, after 3.5 years that we didn't see any kind of sign from the Russian side that there was a willing for dialogue. So something is changing, something has changed.
Hello, everyone. This is Outnumbered. I'm Emily Campagno, and joining us today, Molly Lyon, Fox News correspondent, Nicole Parker, former FBI special agent, Fox News contributor Lydia Hu, Fox Business correspondent as well, and Lawrence Jones, co-host of Fox and Friends. Now, security guarantees were a major talking point at that key meeting at the White House. European leaders agreed to offer troops to station in Ukraine, which will operate similar to NATO peacekeepers in the event of Russia and Ukraine coming to an agreement. The president says he has not ruled out the idea of putting U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine.
President Putin agreed that Russia would accept security guarantees for Ukraine, and this is one of the key points that we need to consider.
Your team has talked about security guarantees. Could that involve U.S. troops? Would you rule that out in the future?
We're meeting with 7 great leaders of great countries also, and we'll be talking about that. They'll all be involved. They are first line of defense because they're there. They're Europe, but we're going to help them out also.
So now the president is outlining the next steps toward peace, writing on Truth Social, quote, I called President Putin and began the arrangements for a meeting at a location to be determined between President Putin and President Zelenskyy. And after that meeting takes place, we will have a trilat, which would be the 2 presidents plus myself. President Trump says he's optimistic about the trilat meeting, praising his longstanding relationship with President Putin.
I called President Putin yesterday, and I do have a good relationship, but it, only matters if we get things done. Otherwise, I don't care about the relationship. I do have a good relationship with him, but I want to get things done. I've solved 7 wars. We ended 7 wars. I thought this would be one of the easier ones, and this has turned out to be the toughest one.
Lawrence Jones, a lot to unpack there on the heels of yesterday, which was a tremendous step toward possibly peace. What is your take?
Well, so often when you hear people talk about Donald Trump, you hear them call him the master negotiator. I think we saw master negotiator turn into master diplomat. And it was for the benefit of the country, obviously, but also the world. I don't think there's been ever a time you've seen a president of the United States have so many world leaders in the Oval Office surrounding the Resolute desk. And I think we've seen the European leaders buy into the philosophy. And Trump won, there was some animosity. At the beginning of his term, you even had some of them talking behind the scenes, going in front of the camera. And they realized that's just not how this president does business. He operates from a place of strength for our country first, but then he wants the killing to stop. So he increased the spending when it came to NATO. That was big, getting it to 5%. But also giving the Ukrainians the weapons and saying, look, I don't want any bloodshed. I don't want to go to war. That is not my objective here. And he did something that I think, I don't know if we could have predicted. So Putin said his red line was the Ukrainians joining NATO. Okay, the president took that. Okay, no, you can't join NATO. But I'm going to give you Article 5 protections. No one has proposed that before. The fact that the president was able to get that done was a big win for the country, also the world. Now we got to flesh out the details.
Right. And Molly, you and I covered this live yesterday together. What a strong, united front presented by so many European countries that was sending a message not only to the Ukrainian people, we are standing by you, but also to Putin that President Trump is not alone in his protection and determination with the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, it was remarkable to watch all of these 7 European leaders come in, being welcomed into the White House and begin this meeting. And we have to realize there was so much for planning before this, getting NATO to put the extra money behind it. So there's actually sort of the meat and potatoes behind the people that are sitting at this big table. Giorgia Meloni, the Italian leader, who's trailblazer in her own right, sitting there next to the president, talked about how he'd done something remarkable to bring this dialogue into place. And that nation is one of those that first put forth the idea of the Article 5 protections. So these are people that are coming around. And a lot of phone calls have been made since these leaders left the table. The coalition of the willing, they've been talking, deciding among themselves, among all of these European nations, not just the ones that were at this table, but a much broader group, what exactly those potential protections, those security guarantees that Zelenskyy wants, what they're going to actually look like.
Lydia, talk to us about the stick that President Trump has in the way of sanctions and tariffs toward Russia, because we know that last night, the night of these peace talks, Russia still lobbed a bunch of missiles in Ukraine's way. So this is still a deadly war despite meeting and negotiations. So what happens next for Russia economically with Trump at the helm?
Yeah, Putin still continues to prove that he is really bloodthirsty in his attempts to conquest against Ukraine. But you're right. President Trump has so beautifully wielded his economic agenda that he still has a lot of levers that he can pull in putting Russia in the corner. There's still sanctions that they can employ on the SWIFT system and further excluding Russia from international banking and international transacting, which would make it really difficult for them to continue to do business on the global stage. They can still put pressure on all of their global trading partners, talk about India, talk about China as well. Huge stick there. We can also force our European counterparts, whom we just met with yesterday, to increase their own sanctions. Stop buying even refined oil products that are made from Russian oil. Okay, you're not buying oil products directly from Russia, but don't even buy the refined stuff that India is making from Russian oil. So there's still a lot of levers that President Trump has made, and it's because he got this ball rolling with that beautiful Trump trade and tariff policy.
Yeah. So, Nicole, we heard yesterday that the potential for U.S. troops might be a reality, and that's surprising to a lot of Americans who knew that this president stands for peace and the end to these unending sort of wars. So what is your take on that and how that will play out?
I think that, some of us were surprised to hear that for sure, because, again, President Trump is the one that's going in and trying to end all of these wars. But I think he understands what is necessary in order to bring an end to this. And he's saying, look, U.S., we stand behind you. We support you. I think what's really stunning in all of this is President Trump's ability to strike it while it's hot. And that's a saying that I have always lived by. And he is looking at this moment. I mean, it was completely dead. No talks or discussions for 3.5 years. Millions. It's just so sad, the tragedy, the deaths. And he's saying, you know what, we're going to get in and make a difference. And he's not just talking, he's doing. He had the meeting with Putin on Friday, and then he turns around and has a meeting with all of these powerful individuals from Europe and these leaders. And I think people are waking up to this. And again, he tempers the excitement with saying, look, we're dealing with Putin, okay? We're all very excited and hoping for a peaceful ending here, but let's be realistic. But I think the key also in this is Melania Trump, and I have to give it to her. That letter that she wrote to Putin that we have now found out was about the children. I think that she has such a powerful influence on President Trump and in our ability, and I do think it comes down to human lives. Trump was kind of joking this morning about maybe this will help him get to heaven. You know what? Saving 5,000 to 7,000 lives a week, I think you're pretty secure in making it to heaven, and that is his goal, is to end the deaths.
And that's what it is about for the president, Emily. And he said something in our interview this morning on Fox and Friends. He said there are members of the European Union, members of the heads of state that visited him, that said they were concerned about things going back to the old way once his presidency was over. He goes, I don't want this to just be a 2 to 3 year end to the war. I want long-lasting peace. And I think that's going to be the key with these negotiations as they come.
And certainly if that trilat meeting happens following on the heels of the Zelenskyy-Putin meeting, I mean, historic does not even begin to cover it. Pursue a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. It could be his ticket to heaven. Watch.
If I can save 7,000 people a week from being killed, I think that's a pretty... I want to try and get to heaven if possible. I'm hearing I'm not doing well. I hear I'm really at the bottom of the totem pole. But if I can get to heaven, this will be one of the reasons.
But before the president cashes in at the pearly gates, he's got a war to end. President Trump speaking with Vladimir Putin and started laying the groundwork for a historic trilateral meeting between himself, Zelenskyy, and Russia's leader. And according to a new report, the White House is eyeing the Hungarian capital of Budapest as the potential meeting spot. As for those security guarantees, European leaders agreed to offer troops to station in Ukraine, which will operate similar to NATO peacekeepers in the event of Russia and Ukraine coming to an agreement. But President Trump says there will be no U.S. boots on the ground. Here's 47.
I think really they have respect for our country again. A year ago, they wouldn't have come. I called President Putin yesterday, and I do have a good relationship, but it only matters if we get things done. Otherwise, I don't care about the relationship. I hope President Putin is going to be good, and if he's not, it's going to be a rough situation. And I hope that President Zelenskyy will do what he has to do. He has to show some flexibility.
European leaders are giving President Trump praise for breaking the logjam with Russia and nudging the war closer to peace. The only ones not cheering? The liberal media, who still want him to flop.
He melted like ice in the Alaska sun as soon as he met with Putin.
It's Trump and Putin versus all of the good guys.
Vladimir Putin is a thug. He's a war criminal. He should not be trusted, and he plays Donald Trump like a fiddle. All four of those things are true.
Greg Gutfeld, so you were just saying, same pattern.
Yeah, nothing new. Budapest. You know what that is? When a monk has fleas. You know you're in a dark place when you're rooting against peace. Because you hate the guy who's brokering. You hate his personality. It's like having a heart surgeon that saves the life of your spouse, but you don't like him because he doesn't recycle. Maybe it's not that important that you don't like him, because if you're rooting against him for doing something good, then that makes you the bad guy. The Never-Trumpers could learn something from that heaven quote. He may go to heaven if he saves thousands of lives a day. So Trump haters will seize on the idea that he's always out for himself. He wants to get into heaven, ignoring the fact that Trump's intentions also align with everyone else's. Trump personally wanted Zelenskyy to dress better. That was his desire, but it helped Zelenskyy too by dressing up. He's like the dad who wants his son, Timmy, to mow the lawn because he wants a nice lawn, but then Timmy learns the value of hard work and gets some money in his pocket. It's win-win, as my uncle who stutters says. As for the media and these idiots, They don't matter. You don't have to listen to them. This is a post-media world we're living in. You know, after relentlessly pushing Russiagate, Trump has every right to preface every announcement with a middle finger to the mainstream media. Russiagate was designed to destroy him and preserve a Cold War mentality with Russia. That is why they were pushing Ukraine into NATO, which is like Russia pushing Canada into the Warsaw Pact. So it makes you think, what would it have been like without Russiagate? A few million people might be alive that are now dead.
Ugh. Dana, what's the significance of the potential for the trilat or the meeting between Zelensky and Putin?
Well, I think that even though you had the European leaders saying something has changed here and we think it is you. Now, some in the media would say, oh, they only came here knowing they had to flatter Trump. It also happens to be true.
Yes.
And I did find it a little bit interesting. So Susan Rice, who was one of the clips there, she was in the Obama administration when Putin took Crimea. She was part of the Biden administration. She was in the Domestic Policy Council, but basically in witness protection. I don't think she's ever answered a question about how Biden was able to or not unable to do his job in the White House. So it's a level of which I can't totally comprehend when they oversaw 2 incursions from Russia into Ukraine. And now they have the gall to say, oh, he's kissing up to Putin. I can understand that some people would quibble with the way the Alaska summit turned out, right? Maybe you don't need the red carpet, but you got the B-2 bombers flying overhead. Maybe you don't need a big handshake and you don't need to give them a platform, but how else were you going to get them to the table? And now you have a real chance for peace. I think that the progress towards ending the war is something that we haven't seen in several years. And I want to also say something that she's not asking for attention or credit, but I do believe that the First Lady and her conscience and her ability to say, please, husband, I don't know what she calls him, Donald, can you please hand deliver this to Putin? And it was a poignant letter. And I think both of them are very mission focused. Okay, so the mission is help try to end the war and do what we have to do, and also maybe take a hit because you're giving Putin a platform. But if you don't give Putin the platform, he's not going to come to the table. So now you do have a real possibility for peace. It might not work, but we had no sort of movement like this. President Biden constantly said, as long as it takes. He didn't say whatever it takes. And Trump is not saying that either necessarily, but he is saying, I am going to be the one that gets everybody to the table. And I think that even some in the media are grudgingly having to admit it.
That's the thing, because when so many lives are at stake, Jesse, if there's an even remote chance at peace, isn't that incredible? And shouldn't everyone be on board to applaud any way that we could achieve with peacefulness the resolution of this war?
Well, it's really all about getting into heaven. And I think he's kidding, but he's also partially serious. And that's why we love him, because he has this childlike spirit, this Sunday school of thought that if you just do good things, there's a chance. And it's like the guy likes cheeseburgers and candy and nicknames. And that's kind of why we relate to him, because he's so relatable and revels in these childlike moments. But we can all understand wanting to do good, so we walk into those pearly gates. Now, I think he knows he's been a bad boy. And I think we all know he's been a bad boy. He's not the baddest boy. He's not Diddy. But he's done some things. And he knows the things. And we don't even know all the things he's done. But he knows. And after Butler, he believes he was saved. That God saved his life. And that he is now on a mission from God to put America first and to make peace. And that's great. I don't care what motivates him. I read a little bit about Christianity this afternoon. God. Apparently, you actually can't just do good things to get into heaven. There has to be more about faith.
You just learned that today?
Right. Yeah, you can't just do good things and hope it works out. And that's why I'm going in, because I know that Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior, and I'm a really good boy. I'm not nearly as bad as the Donald.
What the hell?
The critics, now they're saying that he shouldn't even meet with him. Nixon went to China and met with Mao. He slaughtered 20 million people. FDR had champagne and caviar and cigars with Stalin. I think another 20 million at that point. Those two guys responsible for more death in the entire world history, maybe Genghis Khan. So there's nothing wrong with meeting with Vladimir Putin. Biden did it. Obama did it.
Biden met with Genghis Khan.
He'll tell you a story about that.
Oh, gosh.
And so they actually got played like a fiddle. Trump's coming in and he's trying to just make peace. And it doesn't matter who the good guys are. When you think about it, Putin thinks he's a good guy. Zelenskyy thinks he's the good guy. Mm-hmm. We obviously know we have the best guy and we have the best country and we have the best intentions. But if the Democrats are going to say the Europeans are the good ones, then how do they square that when the Europeans are saying Trump's amazing and he's bringing more peace at a higher rate than has ever happened before? It's like, what is the Democrat plan? They don't have one to stop the war or win the war. So he's doing all this, and Newsom and Kamala Harris haven't said squat. And if they want to lead this country, they have to say something besides calling Dana a ding-dong.
Shame on him for that happened. Harold, all right, I feel like we sort of were doing half Santa and half heaven. We know getting into heaven is not works related, yes, but let's answer Jesse's question. What is the Democrats' plan? What would be the alternative to this president on his process now?
Well, let me first say, I agree with Jesse. I think that I'm a Christian, and we all try to live our lives and to believe and to have faith to try to get to heaven, and certainly your actions are a big part of that. I heard, but I don't, it's above my pay grade whether the president gets there or not. I hope he gets there. And I do believe if he's able to get an answer here and a solution that is good for Ukraine and good for the Russian people, not Putin, but good for the Russian people, will certainly help him. We should remind ourselves how we got here. A few years ago, several years ago, when they invaded, the Russians invaded, or Putin invaded Ukraine, many believed that Kyiv would fall in 3 or 4 days, if not a week or so. People doubted the resistance and the resiliency and toughness of the Ukrainian people. It's an amazing thing when you're fierce and pugnacious because you want to dictate your own future and live on your own land, what that may do. We talked about it yesterday, the adaptability of the Ukrainian people to learn how to use the weapons. We have the greatest weapon systems, greatest munitions in the world we develop and produce right here in America. And we've sent them to them for many years. And they have used them against the military that many people believe might be the second strongest military or third strongest military in the world, maybe behind China, if not in front of China, but certainly behind us. And the Ukrainians have basically rebuffed them in so many ways, in the strongest of ways. Now we find ourselves at a time where you have a president who I genuinely believe has a special set of skills, and talents as it relates to trying to bring solutions to challenges. I wish the president hadn't said this morning on the Great Fox and Friends show that he would not send troops. Even if he was not willing to send American troops, I would not have taken that chip off the table. But I understand where he's going. I think part of that might be appealing to some in his base. It's amazing. The great Mario Cuomo once said that you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. And sometimes the campaign poetry can clash with or contradict with when you have to govern. Mr. President, you're doing a great job up to this point. Don't hold into account what the Democrats are saying. I will say that Michael Mafal, the former Russian ambassador, U.S. citizen who was a Russian ambassador, praised what the president was able to do with the Europeans there at the White House yesterday. I think the president's entering the toughest part of this, though. He has to decide if sanctions should be restored and if we should continue to give them weapons, including offensive weapons, to go against the Russians. The sad thing is, as much as Putin was good in Alaska, he's still attacking the Ukrainians. So do we try to achieve some sort of ceasefire as they try to create some peace? I'm not going to second guess the president at the moment. I remain optimistic that as I hear him talk and even hear the European leaders talk, Team Europe, I thought the most formidable thing was to see them in the White House yesterday together, speaking as one. If they can continue to do that, I think we can get an end to this thing. And the president may be well on his way to those when he wants to, when the Lord decides it's his time to the pearly gates.
It's pearly gates. All right, guys, up next, Democrats think they can copy MAGA and that voters will suddenly...
President Trump says that he will sort of allow Putin and Zelenskyy to meet one-on-one together first before, hopefully, he had said earlier today, joining them at a possible future sit-down in hopes of closing a deal in a trilateral discussion. He spoke with Fox and Friends earlier this morning.
So I hope President Putin is going to be good. And if he's not, it's going to be a rough situation. And I hope that President Zelenskyy will do what he has to do. He has to show some flexibility also.
That pretty much says it all. Let's bring in retired four-star General Jack Keane, Fox News senior strategic analyst, former Army Vice Chief of Staff and chairman of the Institute for the Study of War. General, great to have you with us today. The president, when he says, I hope Putin is going to be good, if not, it is going to be rough. I think that pretty much, that sort of says where we are right now, right?
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Let me just preface my comments by also complimenting what took place yesterday. It was, quite extraordinary. What we really see is the president has established genuine momentum, Martha, and not only the obvious unity that those leaders were displaying, but they're now exhibiting his resolve and his determination and his energy to find peace as soon as possible. That in itself, I've not seen before. And in terms of going forward, the security guarantees are a big deal. And I know for a fact that that is the task that has been given to the Pentagon. And so the chairman of Joint Chiefs is personally involved. The Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, who's a U.S. general, is involved in that process. They are meeting with all the chiefs of defense of the countries that are willing to participate and find out what it is they're willing to put into this. And Zelensky's team, defense team, is also participating. And that would also drive what the United States will contribute based on what others are putting into the security guarantees. And the reason these are so critical, because obviously we have a peace agreement, the security guarantees go in place, and they prevent Putin from attacking. What he has done time and time again in violating ceasefires or violating peace agreements. That has been his method, and we have to take that away from him and provide deterrence. But here's the other thing that's so important, to get all of this done before the next meeting, because if we have real security guarantees that have teeth in them, and Zelenskyy sees it and accepts the reality of that, we really do have deterrence here. And as a result of that, that gives him plenty of running room to put together some options in terms of a counteroffer that Putin has on the table. You know what his offer is. You've been talking about it. He has to give up the rest of the Donetsk region, even though he doesn't own that territory, and freeze everything else. Well, Zelenskyy can come up with some other options that may be attractive to Putin and maybe not as detrimental to himself. He's got plenty of options, but with security guarantees, he can move in that direction with more confidence and accept a greater degree of risk. So this is a critical stage we're at here.
Absolutely. I want to squeeze in one quick question from you, if I may, General. Do you think it's a good idea for Putin and Zelenskyy to meet without anyone else there, just one-on-one? And do you think that will happen? Do you see Putin saying yes to that in Switzerland or in Budapest?
I don't see any problem with it at all, because at some point that has to happen. And if we can get it done now, it'll be a tough meeting. I mean, they're all going to go in there with their very strong positions, obviously, and find out, where the give may be in that process. And I think that's why some others would advocate it would be good if President Trump is in there, because he could kind of, get in the middle of some of that and put some things on the table that maybe both of them could agree to. But at some point, I think it's right to bring President Trump into it. If Putin and Zelenskyy, both of them want to meet one-on-one, let's get on with it. Yeah. Because the sooner we start resolving their differences, the better.
And just on the way out here, the NATO military leaders are all meeting in Brussels tomorrow. They'll be discussing the security guarantee package that you have just referred to, General. So we'll continue our coverage and all of our discussions with you. Thank you. It's great to have you with us during these really consequential times. Thank you very much, General.
Yeah, as always, pleasure to be here, Martha.
Thank you, sir.
What kind of outcomes could we be looking at here? For that, we use
game theory. You may have heard of it. I love game theory. Whether or not it's Love is Blind on Netflix or it's Golden Balls, a famous game show from the United Kingdom. It's a way of analyzing a situation of conflicting interest in terms of gains and losses. Let's go to the wall to talk about the players and the game and the pieces at play. Of course, in this game, this game of chess on the world stage, the players are Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The United States and Europe also involved. But the pieces at play right now in this negotiation are land. Will Russia get control of a contested portion of Donetsk it currently does not control? Security guarantees. Article 5 basically is constituted in a NATO guarantee. Security measures for Ukraine. Will it include the United States? And if neither of these pieces can be moved around, will there be continued attacks? And there were, as recently as last night. So here to help us decode what Vladimir Putin may be thinking is former KGB agent Jack Barsky. Jack, thanks for being with us here today. But just to establish your familiarity with the way things work in Russia, your experience with the KGB, will you quickly share with our audience, you worked as a KGB agent in the United States for years before eventually deciding that you wanted to be on the side of the United States?
Yes, sir. I was an undercover illegal in the United States for 10 years.
All right, and that gave you obviously deep knowledge of not just the way the KGB thinks, but perhaps any KGB agent, including Vladimir Putin. Now you're on the side of the good guys. Now you're on the side of the United States. I'm not going to force you into this analysis through game theory, but I do want to ask you, the game at play seems to me a bit of Sophie's choice or a catch-22. Putin has suggested to Zelenskyy, give up land, get security guarantees, but you might not retain power in Ukraine. Or Zelenskyy can choose not to give up the land, continue to prosecute the war, and maybe lose the entirety of Ukraine.
Yeah, and here's the thing. I'm picturing Zelenskyy and Putin sitting at the same table, staring at each other. They hate each other like two people can hate each other, period. And that hatred is rooted in the history of both nations, started with in the Middle Ages with when the Kiev Rus was formed. And I know enough Ukrainians and Russians to know that this hatred is not going to end. So here's the problem. Assuming that there is a proposal on the table that comes from the United States, based on what you just said, that means both players have to give something up and have to trust that the other side gives something up. It's also, there's a personal aspect involved. Both of these guys are narcissists, political narcissists who are working diligently on their legacy. They can't walk away as losers. So they don't trust each other. And so how can they trust that the other side will give something up too, so they can walk away as not losers, but sort of at least play it that way that, we won something.
You describe the historical hatred between these two countries, but you've also brought this down to the personal level, describing them as political narcissists. If you think about this, then, the players, in personal terms, how can you find the compromise that both of these players get a win?
You talk about security guarantees, but again, trust comes into the picture. I think Zelenskyy will trust the United States and our president, and I believe that Putin has reason to trust Donald Trump, but he doesn't trust the United States and the West. We have been so adamantly anti-Russian in the recent history, based on the Democrat administrations, but also the alt-right. We had a senator of the United States in public call Vladimir Putin a war criminal. Why would I want to trust these people? If they come back to power, whatever they guarantee, I can't trust. So I am sorry, I'm not very, very positive about this here. And I'm generally an optimistic kind of guy. Without optimism, I wouldn't be alive today. So.
Well, I unfortunately as well. you're not alone in your pessimism. If we're looking for optimism, we can find it. It is the fact that we have never been this far downfield. I hope you've been in the United States long enough to appreciate the football analogy. In my analogy, we may not be necessarily close to the end zone, but we've never been further down the field in reaching an agreement to end this war. Jack Barsky, fascinating conversation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Major progress. That is what former U.S. Ambassador to Russia under President Obama is saying about the meeting at the White House yesterday with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy and the European leaders. Watch this.
Whoever had the idea to bring all these European leaders together, in addition to President Zelenskyy, that was a brilliant, brilliant idea. And having it come so quickly after Alaska was also very important because now they've changed the talking points here.
Okay, with that, let's bring in Ambassador Monica Crowley. She is currently U.S. Chief of Protocol. We watched her welcoming all of these leaders to the White House. She served as Assistant Secretary in the Treasury in the first Trump administration and a foreign policy assistant to former President Nixon. Monica, great to see you. Welcome to the program. You have been very, very busy. Here's a photo of you shaking hands with President Putin on the tarmac in Alaska. And then we have you welcoming all of these foreign leaders as they came to the White House the other day. And take a look at the East Room. I just want to move through these images because there were translator booths set up in the East Room. There's a ladder in the back of the room and a bunch of people sitting at microphones to try to translate all of these conversations. So how'd you pull that off, and how much time did you have to make this happen?
Well, it's great to be with you, Martha. Thank you so much. Yeah, we were returning from Alaska, which was a very productive meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin. We were coming back to Washington, D.C., and at about 2 a.m. on Saturday morning, while we were still on the plane, the president was making a series of phone calls around the world, and we heard that President Zelenskyy was coming to the White House at 1 p.m. on Monday. So we essentially had 36 hours to gather 8 world leaders, including 6 heads of state, gather them at the White House and make sure every detail was taken care of to ensure the greatest environment, Martha, for the most robust, effective diplomacy. And I think we saw yesterday that only President Trump could convene this kind of gathering of so many world leaders on such short notice in pursuit of peace between Russia and Ukraine. You need a president who's a visionary leader, who is absolutely committed to the peace process, and this president is. I mean, he's already settled about half a dozen other world conflicts around the globe, and this one, as the president has said, has certainly proven to be the most difficult, but he is also incredibly committed to ensuring peace for all of the people in that region.
Yeah, I think everybody would like to see this come to an end. It's hard to imagine why anyone wouldn't want there to be peace in Ukraine after all of the war over the last 3 years. You know, it is stunning, and I bring this image up of President Biden at the G7 summit in Italy when Prime Minister Meloni was sort of guiding him back to the rest of the group, only because you are hearing from people like Mark Penn and Michael McFaul, who worked in Democrat administrations, who are just recognizing the energy of the president, of President Trump, in terms of trying to pull together. And he says himself, you know, who knows if this is going to work, but the effort.
Yes, 100%, Martha. I mean, we all talk about the superhuman strength and superhuman energy of President Trump. He literally works around the clock to make America great again, of course, but he also has these external issues like the war between Russia and Ukraine, which, as he says, would never have started if he had been president. It certainly didn't start in his first term, but he is left with a lot of issues that are very complicated, very dangerous. He's left with all of that to clean up from the Biden years. And so he is absolutely committed to doing it. He really is a man of peace. And of course, President Trump is driven by strategic imperatives for America's national security interests. But he is also really interested in saving lives. And he said it this morning on Fox and Friends. He said, I hope to get to heaven someday. And I hope by saving thousands of lives will help get me there.
He said, I don't know how it's going. I'm not sure if it's going well, but that's what I hope. Monica, we got to go. But was there anything that was like, you know, you're a foreign policy expert, but you're also handling in protocol all of these different, you know, world leaders, and this is how this person likes to do it. Was there anything that was like a, oh my gosh, that's not going to work moment for you?
No, because I think all parties are interested in achieving a peace, and this is what the president has said. So the meetings with President Putin in Alaska, and then, of course, yesterday with President Zelenskyy and all of the European leaders, there has been a change in the dynamic. Prime Minister Maloney talked about this yesterday with the president. These two sets of meetings have been game changers for the peace process.
Well,
This peace is not going to happen overnight. You know, we've talked about the peace process in the Middle East. Peace is a process, but only President Trump could have achieved this, bringing both sides and all of these other supporting leaders to the table in record time and getting this process down the path toward peace.
Well, the fact that they all sort of shed, you know, what in other circumstances might have been their preferences for where they want to sit, and this is all only come under this circumstance, I think says quite a bit, actually. And so do we know yet where and when the meeting is going to be with Zelenskyy and Putin? There were some locations floating around this afternoon, including Budapest.
Yes. Well, I don't want to get in front of the president and any announcements that he may want to make on that. But it was reported this morning that, you know, the president is a man of immediacy and urgency, especially when it comes to saving lives and ending conflicts. So he has indicated that he wants it to happen sooner rather than later. And so that bilateral between Presidents Putin and Zelenskyy could happen within the next 2 weeks, Martha.
Okay, we'll be watching. Ambassador Crowley, thank you very much. Great.
For more on this, let's bring in Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State and a Fox News contributor. Mr. Secretary, good to have you with us today. So, what do you, John? So, what do you think would happen if Zelenskyy and Putin do sit down across the table from each other in a bilat in the next couple of weeks or so?
Well, I think that'd be real progress. Certainly wouldn't happen under President Biden. Look, they'll get a chance to both state their positions. They'll each state maximalist or relatively maximalist positions because they know that there is some tough negotiating that lays ahead. So neither of them is going to walk in with just a deal that the other one's going to say yes to. So we shouldn't hope for that. But they'll begin to take the measure of where you can actually resolve this. And you start to see it take shape. You heard the European leaders talk about this in the White House yesterday. They began to think about what the security guarantees would look like, what the architecture of that would look like, realistically where the line of contact might resolve, and ultimately how you might deliver a long, just, and lasting peace in Europe in a way that President Biden simply couldn't achieve.
So in terms of the line of contact, we know that Putin floated to President Trump that he would like all of the Donbass region, including the part of Donetsk, Sloviansk, and Kramatorsk, which is under Ukrainian control right now. I mean, can you see Zelenskyy saying, yes, you can have that in return for security guarantees from European countries and the United States?
John, that seems very unlikely to me. It seems to me the line of contact will almost certainly be wherever the forces are, that is, where the actual line of contact exists when the agreement is reached. I think that's why it's going to require even more U.S. pressure in the days and weeks ahead, because Putin today thinks, look, why do a ceasefire if you're inching along? And it's expensive, lots of manpower, lots of losses, but still firing a couple hundred rockets, drones into Ukraine every night, putting pressure on Zelenskyy, and then making advances along that line. So I think he's going to chase real estate until the agreement hits, and the United States is going to have to demonstrate that it and its European partners are prepared to impose real cost on Putin before he'll come to say, yep, okay, good enough, and then allow the security architecture to fall into place.
In terms of exacting real costs against Putin, I was speaking with the former Vice President Mike Pence earlier today, who has the position that he believes that President Trump should immediately levy severe sanctions on Russia just to keep Putin focused. And he reminds me of, and I followed him on this trip, we went to Turkey, where he talked with Erdogan about leaving the Kurds alone. And he said the one piece of leverage that he really had to get Erdogan to do what he wanted was a list of sanctions that President Trump was going to slap on Turkey if he didn't play ball. What do you think about that idea?
John, I actually remember that. We ended up sanctioning the Turkish foreign minister, I think their finance minister. Those sanctions stayed in place for less than 48 hours before the Turkish leadership cried uncle. Yeah, I think in the end that's probably right. Remember what Putin will be giving up. By allowing the security architecture, everybody talks about troops on the ground. The most important thing he'll be giving up is that the Ukrainian airspace will be patrolled by the coalition of the willing. No longer missiles and rockets able to be fired into Kyiv and surrounding civilian populaces. So he's going to keep at this on the ground until there is economic pressure. I think the way you just described it, it makes sense. And we shouldn't forget the critical nature of these secondary sanctions, not only against India, our friend, our partner, but against the Chinese, who continue to provide resources to the Russians that are killing Ukrainian kids every night.
One last point I wanted to ask you about, and that's the legacy media's take on everything that's happened since Friday. They were very critical of what happened in Anchorage. And here are some of the headlines from yesterday's meeting. New York Times, Europe's leaders headed off giveaway to Putin. Washington Post, Europeans, Ukraine steer Trump away from Putin's view after summit. Independent UK, Trump broke off his meetings with Europe's leaders to call his friend in the Kremlin. Why? The Guardian, all smoke but no fire as Zelenskyy emerges unbruised after Trump meet. And Caroline Levitt went off today at the beginning of the briefing about all of the, to quote Spiro Agnew again, nattering nabobs of negativism who've been riding Trump over something that seems to be working.
It's actually worse today than when Agnew made that statement. They were just ignorant then. Now they are downright malicious and anti-Trump, and you can see that. Look, they forgot that President Trump for 4 years didn't give up an inch or allow an inch of Ukraine to be given up. We were very successful at deterring Vladimir Putin. They forget the historical fact that this invasion occurred because for a year Putin built up troops and the United States and Europe did nothing. And so, my advice to the White House and the press team is ignore these folks. It's all just foolishness. Stay on the mission, stay focused, get real objectives, get real outcomes on the ground, and deliver a just and lasting peace for Europe. It's achievable. It's a lot of hard work, but if you pay attention to the New York Times and the Washington Post, you're only going to cause your own cardiologist to have to prescribe more medicine.
Well, there's another famous saying, and that is, you'll never be criticized by someone who's doing more than you. So,
Well said, John. Well said.
We'll see where this goes. Mr. Secretary, good to catch up with you. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I thought I'd do first let them meet. They haven't been exactly best friends. I called President Putin, and we're trying to work out a meeting with President Zelenskyy. We'll see what happens there. And then if it works out, then I'll go to the trilat and close it up.
So President Trump just moments ago on a potential key meeting in the works. So he's trying to broker a deal between Ukraine and Russia after a war that has dragged on for nearly 3.5 years. And joining us now is Bill Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Before I ask you about what's to come, wanted to get your sense of what happened over the last 24 hours here in Washington, D.C. with all those European leaders here.
I think that we had very good conversation with President Trump.
Very good.
And it really was the best one.
I really want to thank you, President of the United States, dear Donald, for the fact that you, as I said before, broke the deadlock, basically with President Putin by starting that dialogue.
We didn't see any kind of sign from the Russian side that there was a willing for dialogue. So something is changing, something has changed, thanks to you.
So far, nobody's been able to bring it to this point, so I thank you for that.
Let me now get your take on those European leaders from yesterday.
As I was saying, that the unity was amazing. It was striking that here they were, called by President Trump, dropping what they were doing, all showing up in support of Ukraine, in support of President Zelenskyy, because they want President Zelenskyy, they want Ukraine to stop the Russians in Ukraine. This is about European security. President Macron made this point many times. This is why they are so supportive of Ukraine. That's why they're stepping up. The Europeans are stepping up to provide weapons, finances, and even a coalition of the willing to put troops on the ground in Ukraine.
Let's talk about security guarantees for a second, but first we'll listen to President Trump talking about it from Fox and Friends.
President Putin agreed that Russia would accept security guarantees for Ukraine, and this is one of the key points that we need to consider.
We spoke about very sensitive points. The first one is security guarantees, and we are very happy with President that all the leaders are here, and the security in Ukraine depends on the United States and on you and on those leaders who are with us in our hearts.
He was asked this morning by Lawrence Jones, so what would that look like from the American standpoint? seems like it's unclear at this point, but overall, these security guarantees are something that Zelenskyy needs to convince his people to go along with this deal. And I imagine the Europeans are willing to do it because they're worried about their own future security.
Absolutely, Dana. That's exactly what they're worried about. They want Russia to be stopped by the Ukrainians in Ukraine rather than threatening them. So they're willing to put troops on the ground. This is a real security guarantee. There have been commitments before and memos and the Budapest memorandum that tried to give security, didn't. Troops on the ground, a coalition of the willing with actual forces on the ground to be able to backstop, to sit behind the Ukrainians and make it clear that the Russians cannot reinvade. And there's a role for the United States in that. Doesn't have to be boots on the ground, but there's an important role for the United States that President Trump has now acknowledged.
Can I get one quick thought from you about Zelenskyy and Putin maybe meeting one-on-one?
Your last, so Guy mentioned that Putin is the face of evil in Ukraine. So this, Zelenskyy will be there with gritted teeth. But in order to end this war, he has to sit down, and he's ready. Zelenskyy says he's ready to do it.
Yeah. Well, Zelenskyy might have gritted teeth, but Putin might have fangs out. So that is going to be one to watch. And President Trump says that he'll go in at the last minute if they can get a deal. All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. We'll have you back.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.